My name is Jordan, and at 34 years old, I never expected my own husband to expose the biggest lie in my family history. Everyone in the ballroom was cheering for my older brother Terrence, who supposedly saved countless lives as an army medic overseas in Sudan. He was our undisputed family hero, the golden child who could do no wrong. I grabbed my champagne glass ready to celebrate his safe return until my husband Mark, a forensic investigator, pulled my wrist down tight. He leaned in close and warned me that my brother's entire story was completely fake. What Mark whispered to me in that crowded room would shatter my family forever. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member. Growing up in Chicago, my mother Gloria made sure the world revolved around Terrence. While I spent my 20s building my gemology and jewelry appraisal business, Terrence drifted from one expensive failure to another. He always had a grand plan requiring my mother's funding and my silent compliance. Yet tonight you would think he was a saint. The lavish welcome home banquet was held at an exclusive hotel downtown. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables covered in white linen and floral centerpieces. Hundreds of people from our church and community packed the elegant room. They were captivated by the man standing proudly on the stage. Terrence wore a tailored suit, holding the microphone with the easy confidence of a politician. My mother Gloria sat at the front table, wearing an extravagant silver gown glowing with pride. She nodded along to every word, making sure everyone saw her as the devoted mother of a hero. Terrence lowered his voice to a dramatic whisper, recounting his supposed time in the harsh desert. He talked about the intense heat, the constant danger, and the helpless children he claimed to have treated in makeshift field hospitals. Then came the grand finale of his speech. With a perfectly rehearsed sigh of emotional exhaustion, Terrence slowly unbuttoned the top of his crisp white shirt and pulled the fabric aside. He exposed his right shoulder to the crowd, revealing a jagged, raised scar against his dark skin. He told the silent room he received the terrible wound when he threw his body over a young local boy during a sudden rebel ambush. He claimed a heavy-caliber bullet grazed his shoulder as he shielded the child from incoming gunfire. The ballroom erupted in loud gasps and thunderous applause. Women wiped genuine tears from their eyes. Older men nodded their heads in deep respect. I felt a swell of complex emotions. Despite our painful past, I was genuinely relieved he was alive. I reached for my champagne glass to join the toast honoring his bravery. That was the exact moment Mark firmly grabbed my wrist. His grip was strong enough to instantly stop my hand, but gentle enough not to draw unwanted attention. Mark spent the last decade analyzing gruesome crime scenes, examining physical wounds, and finding absolute truth in microscopic details. I looked at him in total surprise, expecting him to be moved by the emotional speech. Instead, his face was completely pale, and his jaw was set in a tight, angry line. He leaned his head down until his mouth was right next to my ear. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words hit me like a physical blow. "Jordan, do not drink to that," he said quietly. His sharp blue eyes never left my brother's shoulder on the brightly lit stage. "That is a surgical scalpel scar, healed with expensive cosmetic grafting. It is a precise medical incision, not a chaotic tear from a bullet graze. He is faking the entire thing." My heart slammed against my ribs. I stared at Mark, trying to somehow comprehend what he was actually saying. I am a gemologist trained to spot the subtle difference between a flawless natural diamond and a clever synthetic fake. Mark was doing the exact same thing right now with my brother's heroic story. He saw the hidden flaw. He saw the massive lie. My mind raced back through the past 3 years. I remembered the vague emails, the aggressive requests for cash, the refusal to let anyone visit. I felt the cold air leave my lungs as the horrifying reality settled in my mind. Before I could ask Mark another question, the applause died down and my mother Gloria stood up from her front row seat. She grabbed a microphone from an event staffer and turned to face the crowd. Her eyes scanned the room until they locked directly onto me, sitting quietly near the back doors. She smiled warmly, but it was the exact cold, calculated smile she used when trapping me in front of others. "Ladies and gentlemen," my mother announced, her voice echoing through the sound system, "we are incredibly blessed to have our hero home tonight. But the poor children he left behind still desperately need our financial help. Terrence is officially launching a trauma recovery fund tonight to send vital medical supplies back to the village that sheltered him. To start, I want to call upon my successful daughter, Jordan." My mother pointed directly at me, ensuring every face in the huge ballroom turned my way. "Jordan has a thriving luxury business." She continued, her tone dripping with toxic false sweetness. "Stand up, Jordan. Stand up and pledge the first $50,000 to your brother's fund right now. Show everyone here how much you appreciate the sacrifices he made for our freedom." The bright spotlight swung across the room, blinding me. Hundreds of expectant faces stared at me, waiting for me to hand over a fortune to a man my husband just confirmed was a total fraud. The blinding spotlight remained firmly fixed on me, trapping me in a circle of harsh white light. Hundreds of pairs of expectant eyes shifted from the glowing stage directly to my table, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and play my designated role. The silence in the grand ballroom was sudden and absolute. I could hear the faint clinking of silverware from the kitchen corridors and the heavy breathing of the wealthy donors sitting at the tables nearby. Underneath the table, Mark squeezed my hand, his thumb rubbing across my knuckles in a silent but powerful gesture of solidarity. He knew exactly what I was about to do, and he was ready to back me up. I slowly stood up, pushing my heavy dining chair back against the thick hotel carpet. My mother stood on the stage, holding the microphone with a triumphant smirk on her face. She fully expected me to cave under the immense social pressure. She thought I would blindly write a massive check just to avoid public embarrassment, exactly like I had done so many times when I was younger and more desperate for her approval. But the woman standing before her was not a frightened child anymore. I was a successful business owner who appraised millions of dollars in precious stones every single week. I made my living by spotting the microscopic flaws and clever fakes, and I completely refused to finance a walking fraud. "No, Mother," I said, my voice remarkably steady and surprisingly loud in the quiet room. "I will not be donating $50,000 to this fund tonight, or any other night." A collective gasp rippled through the massive audience. The wealthy charity donors and the senior church elders exchanged deeply shocked glances. Up on the stage, my mother's triumphant smile instantly vanished and was quickly replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. Her grip on the microphone tightened so hard her knuckles turned completely white. I could see the muscles in her neck tense as she glared down at me. "How dare you!" She snapped, her voice cracking sharply through the massive speakers and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "After everything this entire family has done for you, this is how you repay us. You are nothing but a selfish, money-obsessed jeweler. You sit in your fancy downtown boutique, hoarding your ridiculous wealth, while your own flesh and blood bleeds in the desert for the less fortunate. You never cared about your community, Jordan. You only care about yourself and your bank account." She paced aggressively across the stage, waving her free hand wildly toward the crowd. "You would not even have that diamond business if your brother had not protected you growing up. He sacrificed his youth to make sure you were safe, and this is your gratitude. You should be absolutely ashamed to show your face in this room tonight." The sheer audacity of her public lies made the blood pound violently in my ears. I stepped away from my table, completely closing the distance between myself and the edge of the stage. I did not need a microphone to respond. Years of commanding tense boardrooms and negotiating with diamond brokers had taught me exactly how to project my voice. Protected me. I echoed, my tone sharp and cutting like a diamond blade. "Is that what we are calling it now? Let us talk about sacrifice, Mother. Let us talk about how I actually built my business." I looked around the room, deliberately making direct eye contact with our relatives and the family friends who had silently judged me for years. "I built my company from absolutely nothing," I stated clearly, making sure my voice reached the very back rows. "Because 10 years ago, when I was finally accepted into the National Gemological Institute, you marched into the bank and completely drained every single penny of my college savings account. You took the money I earned working double shifts throughout my entire high school career, and you handed it all directly to Terrence. You told everyone in our church that he needed a spiritual awakening, but we both know you actually funded a year-long luxury vacation in Europe because he failed out of his very first semester of medical school. The entire ballroom erupted into chaotic murmurs. Several church elders leaned forward, whispering fiercely to one another with wide eyes. My mother turned a deep shade of purple, her mouth opening and closing in absolute shock as her carefully constructed lies were dragged into the light. I pointed directly at Terrence, who was suddenly looking incredibly nervous behind his carefully crafted mask of sorrow. I slept on the bare floor of a freezing studio apartment and worked 3 grueling jobs just to pay for my own tuition. I continued refusing to break eye contact with my mother. I built my entire life with my own 2 hands while you enabled his every single failure. So do not stand up there and tell these good people that I owe him my success. I do not owe him a single dime. And I certainly will not fund whatever massive financial scam he is running today. The perfect image of the heroic family was cracking wide open for everyone to see. I turned around ready to walk away and leave this toxic charade behind forever. But Terrence was a master manipulator who knew exactly how to salvage his captive audience. He stepped forward quickly, grabbing the microphone from our frozen mother. Giant tears began to stream down his face, landing perfectly on the crisp collar of his white shirt. He looked like the absolute picture of a heartbroken saint. "Please," he begged the crowd, his voice shaking with manufactured grief. "Please do not judge my sister harshly tonight. The severe trauma of my absence has clearly taken a terrible toll on her mental health. She is confused, and she is hurting deeply. I love her, and I forgive her completely. We must all show her grace in her dark time." The crowd instantly softened completely, taken in by his brilliant performance. Loud ahs and sympathetic murmurs quickly filled the room, replacing the whispers of doubt. Terrence stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward me, opening his arms wide for everyone to see. Before I could back away, he wrapped his arms tightly around my shoulders, pinning me in a highly forceful hug. To the gullible audience, it looked like a beautiful, touching moment of familial forgiveness. But as he pressed his cheek against mine, his entire demeanor changed in an instant. The fake tears stopped completely. He leaned his mouth right against my ear, and his voice dropped to a cold, vicious whisper that only I could hear. "You are going to pay that money or I will ruin you." He squeezed my shoulders hard enough to bruise aggressively, digging his fingers into my collarbone. "I will destroy your business, your reputation, and your perfect marriage. You have until tomorrow to write the check, little sister." I spent the entire night wide awake in my living room, staring at the dark ceiling while my husband Mark quietly made phone calls to his forensic contacts across the country. The vicious threat my brother whispered in my ear at the banquet echoed in my mind on an endless loop. By the time I arrived at my jewelry boutique the following morning, my nerves were completely frayed, but my resolve was harder than ever. My boutique is my personal sanctuary and the physical representation of everything I built without my family. It is a highly secure space located right in the heart of the Diamond District, equipped with reinforced bulletproof glass doors, armed guards, and velvet-lined display cases holding millions of dollars in rare inventory. I was standing safely behind the main counter, arranging a delicate display of vintage sapphire necklaces when the heavy front door buzzed open loudly. I did not even have to look up from my work to know exactly who had just walked in. The sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive designer heels striking the polished marble floor echoed ominously through the quiet, high-end showroom. My mother Gloria marched straight past my armed security guard, completely ignoring his polite request to sign the visitor registry. She was clutching a thick, heavy, leather-bound portfolio tightly against her chest like a shield. Her face was set in a hard, determined mask, showing absolutely no remorse for her public outburst the night before. She did not bother offering a standard greeting or asking how I was doing. She simply walked right into my private diamond viewing room and dropped the heavy portfolio directly onto my pristine black velvet appraisal mat. "You made a massive, embarrassing fool of yourself last night," she stated, her voice cold and commanding. "But I am a generous woman, and I am willing to forgive your public meltdown if you stop this nonsense and write the check right now. I brought you the concrete proof you apparently need to stop acting like a jealous, bitter child." I calmly placed my microfiber polishing cloth down on the glass case and looked at her directly in the eyes. "Proof of what exactly, mother?" I asked, maintaining my professional composure. "Proof that your golden boy is actually a genuine hero," she snapped aggressively, unzipping the heavy leather portfolio. She quickly pulled out a thick stack of high-resolution glossy photographs and spread them out across the velvet mat like a winning hand of cards. "Terrence knew you would try to maliciously discredit him because you cannot stand seeing him succeed. He gave these to me late last night to show you exactly what he survived over there. Look at them, Jordan. Look at the absolute misery he endured while you sat here in your air-conditioned store playing with shiny little rocks." I looked down at the scattered photographs. They were undeniably dramatic and highly produced. Terrence was front and center, in almost every single shot, perfectly framed by the camera. He was wearing dirt-smudged tactical gear, looking appropriately exhausted, but incredibly noble. In one photo, he was kneeling in the dirt, carefully bandaging the arm of a local man. In another shot, he was standing bravely in front of a dilapidated concrete building, handing out water bottles to a small crowd of desperate-looking people. At first glance, it looked like a gritty award-winning documentary spread. But I do not look at things at first glance. My entire career and my considerable wealth are built entirely on examining the microscopic hidden details that ordinary people completely miss. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or take the bait. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my professional gemologist loupe. It is a small, specialized magnifying cylinder that provides 10 times magnification, allowing me to see the hidden internal structure and the microscopic flaws of a diamond. I unfolded the metal casing, leaned over the velvet mat, and brought my eye just inches away from the glossy surface of the professional prints. "What on earth are you doing?" my mother demanded, crossing her arms defensively across her chest. "You do not need a fancy magnifying glass to see his sacrifice and bravery." I ignored her completely and focused intently on the background lighting of the images. Whoever staged and shot these photos was undeniably good, but they were not perfect. The shadows falling across Terrence's face in the supposed desert camp were entirely too soft and diffused. It looked exactly like high-end commercial photography lighting utilizing bounce boards, not the harsh, unforgiving overhead glare of the midday African sun. I moved my magnifying loupe to the next photograph in the stack. It was a tight close-up shot of Terrence heroically handing a piece of flatbread to a local man. The man was wearing a worn-out, tattered shirt and a pair of cheap mirrored aviator sunglasses to block the bright sunlight. I hovered my magnifying loupe directly over the curved, reflective surface of the unknown man's sunglasses. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the image clarified. When you magnify a high-resolution photographic print, you can easily see the microscopic environmental details captured in reflective surfaces. The reflection in the right lens of the sunglasses did not show a war-torn desert refugee camp. It clearly showed the very distinct modern edge of a bright blue infinity pool. Behind the pool, there was a pristine white luxury resort cabana with sheer decorative curtains blowing gently in the ocean wind. I squinted hard, moving the loupe slightly to the left to examine the other lens. It was even more damning than the first. Caught perfectly in the curved reflection of the left lens was a local resort waiter wearing a crisp white hospitality uniform, holding a silver tray loaded with tall tropical drinks. The man in the photo was not a desperate starving refugee in a war zone. He was more than likely a local resort worker paid a few dollars to put on a dirty shirt and pose for a staged photo shoot in some tropical vacation destination. The entire heroic narrative, the scars, the trauma, the desperate pleas for charity money, was a carefully constructed visual lie designed to steal thousands of dollars. I slowly stood up, folding my metal loupe and deliberately placing it back into my blazer pocket. I looked at my mother, who was currently staring at me with impatient, boiling anger. "Mother," I said, keeping my voice low and incredibly steady. "These photos were not taken in a war zone overseas. He staged every single one of them." "That is a disgusting, unforgivable lie," she hissed violently, slamming her hand onto the glass display counter. "You are absolutely delusional and sick in the head." I turned the glossy photograph around and pushed it slowly across the velvet mat toward her. "Look closely at the reflection in the sunglasses of the man he is supposedly feeding," I explained, pointing directly at the mirrored surface on the print. "There is a modern infinity pool and a luxury cabana right behind the camera. You can literally see a resort waiter holding a tray of tropical cocktails in the background. Your beloved son did not go to a war zone, mother. He took your retirement money and he went to a luxury beach resort to stage a fake photo shoot." For one split second, I saw a sudden terrifying flicker of genuine panic flash behind her eyes. She looked down at the photograph, and I knew without a doubt that she saw exactly what I was talking about. The visual logic was entirely undeniable. The concrete evidence was sitting right in front of her face. But admitting the truth meant admitting that her entire life was a massive lie, and that her perfect golden child was actually a master manipulator who had stolen her entire financial future. Instead of shock or realization, her face twisted abruptly into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged forward over the display case and violently slapped the photographs off the velvet counter. The heavy, glossy prints scattered aggressively across the marble floor like dead leaves in a storm. "You doctored these images," she screamed, her voice turning shrill and hysterical as it echoed through the boutique. "You printed fake photos to replace the real ones just to deliberately smear his good name. You are so violently jealous of the attention and love he gets that you would actually frame your own flesh and blood. You are a sick, bitter woman. Jordan and I will never let you destroy my son." My mother spun around on her expensive heels and stormed out of the boutique, leaving the heavy glass door shuddering violently in her wake. I stood completely alone in the quiet viewing room, taking a deep breath to steady my aggressively racing heart. I slowly bent down to pick up the scattered glossy photographs from the polished marble floor. Just as my fingers brushed the sharp edge of the first picture, a heavy, imposing shadow fell directly across the doorway. I quickly looked up, fully expecting to see my armed security guard checking in on the commotion. Instead, I found my brother Terrence leaning casually against the thick mahogany doorframe. He had completely dropped the wounded, tragic hero posture he so perfectly displayed at the crowded banquet the night before. His broad shoulders were no longer hunched in manufactured pain, and there was absolutely no trace of the fake, lingering limp he used to garner endless sympathy from the wealthy church elders. He looked perfectly healthy, highly confident, and incredibly dangerous. Terrence stepped fully into my private viewing room and smoothly closed the heavy door behind him, effectively cutting us off from the main showroom and my oblivious guard. He looked around the pristine room, taking in the velvet displays and the bulletproof cases before he began to slow clap. The sharp, mocking sound echoed loudly in the small, secure space. He stated that Mom just called him crying her eyes out, and his voice was completely devoid of the warm, charming tone he used to manipulate the public. He mentioned she told him I was playing amateur detective with a fancy magnifying glass. He explicitly told her not to bring those promotional photos to me today. He said I always was entirely too smart for my own good. I stood up, clutching the stack of fake pictures tightly against my chest, refusing to let him intimidate me in my own sanctuary. I challenged him, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and asked if he freely admits it then. I told him he staged this entire ridiculous charade at a luxury beach resort in Mexico, while our mother foolishly emptied her entire retirement account to generously fund his fake charity. Terrence laughed, a cold, sharp, terrifying sound that instantly made the hairs on my arms stand up in sudden alarm. He asked, "Admit it to who exactly?" tilting his head mockingly. I replied, "To you." He said he would gladly admit it to me because who on earth am I going to tell? I suggested the church congregation. He countered that they absolutely adore him and they are already writing him massive checks. I mentioned our devoted mother. He pointed out that I just saw exactly how well that logic worked out for me. He stated she would rather aggressively believe he is a deeply wounded war veteran than ever admit to herself that she raised a brilliant con artist. He took a slow, deliberate step closer, entirely invading my personal space. His dark eyes turned incredibly malicious, completely stripping away any remaining illusion of brotherly love. He whispered menacingly that he knows my beloved husband Mark is a very busy man today. He knows Mark is a federal forensic investigator, and he knows he has been making quiet little phone calls to his cop friends, trying to poke holes in his perfect story. I tried to step back instinctively, but my lower back hit the hard edge of the glass display case, trapping me against the counter. I wondered how he could possibly know about Mark making those discreet phone calls so quickly. Terrence smiled wickedly clearly, seeing the sudden hesitation and surprise flash across my face. He bragged, asking if I honestly thought he would orchestrate a highly lucrative multi-million-dollar operation like this without carefully keeping tabs on his own nosy family members. He confirmed he knows absolutely everything Mark is doing behind the scenes. And he stood right there to tell me that Mark needs to stop his little investigation right this exact second. Or else my perfect little rich girl world is going to come crashing down significantly faster than I can possibly blink. I stated firmly, trying desperately to keep my voice steady and strong, that he cannot simply threaten me. I told him I have the visual proof, and I will mercilessly expose him to everyone. He mocked me, stepping even closer, until I could clearly smell his expensive designer cologne, asking with what exactly. I replied, a tiny blurry reflection in a pair of cheap sunglasses. He stated that is not concrete evidence. He called it a pathetic amateur conspiracy theory that no one will ever believe. But then he asked if I want to know what real, undeniable evidence looks like. He leaned in and said blood diamonds. The forbidden words hung heavily in the quiet, secure room like a loaded gun pointed directly at my head. As a licensed gemologist, dealing in illegal, uncertified conflict stones was the ultimate career death sentence. It meant facing massive federal prison time and the complete, devastating destruction of absolutely everything I had painstakingly built over the last decade. He whispered, his tone dropping to a deadly serious register, that he has very powerful friends who deal in extremely dark circles. It would be incredibly easy for him to quietly acquire a small velvet pouch full of uncertified illegal blood diamonds. It would be even easier to have one of his unseen associates casually slip into this busy boutique and hide that pouch right inside my secure back vault. All it takes is one simple anonymous phone call to the federal authorities. They will ruthlessly raid this place, tear my pristine walls apart, and find the illegal stones. I will permanently lose my prestigious license, my thriving business, and my actual freedom. And Mark will permanently lose his government career for being legally married to a federal diamond smuggler. I stared at him, completely paralyzed by the sheer evil magnitude of his calculated plan. He was not just a lazy, greedy manipulator anymore. He was a ruthless, hardened criminal, fully willing to destroy my entire life just to protect his lucrative scam. He demanded I write that check and call off my husband immediately. Terrence gave me one last cold smirk, turned around and casually opened the door. He gave a friendly wave to my security guard outside, instantly putting his hero mask back on before walking out of the boutique. Terrence left thinking he had easily won. I immediately locked the heavy door, pulled out my phone and dialed Mark. He just threatened the business, I said, my voice trembling with pure anger. Take the gloves off, Mark. Dig into absolutely everything. Mark did not hesitate for a single second when he heard the absolute terror and rage in my voice. He told me to lock the vault, go straight home, and let him handle the rest. I spent the afternoon pacing the hardwood floors of our living room, feeling like a prisoner in my own life. While I waited, Mark was sitting in his federal field office, completely bypassing the standard bureaucratic channels. Standard background checks and public military records requests take weeks or even months to process. We did not have weeks. We barely had 24 hours before Terrence executed his devastating threat against my diamond boutique. Mark reached out to a trusted contact deep inside the Department of Defense. It was a former Marine investigator he had helped clear of false charges years ago. Mark gave his contact my brother's full legal name, his supposed deployment dates, and the exact location of the rebel ambush he had so vividly described at the banquet. When Mark finally walked through our front door late that evening, his face was completely drained of color. He did not say a word as he took off his jacket. He just walked straight into the kitchen, dropped a thick, heavy manila folder onto the granite island, and poured himself a glass of water. I stood across from him, my hands shaking as I looked at the unmarked federal file sitting between us. I asked him what he found. Mark looked at me with a mixture of profound disgust and deep sorrow. He explained that Terrence did not just invent a dramatic war story out of thin air. He did something infinitely worse. He committed one of the most despicable acts of fraud possible. He stole the valor and the ultimate sacrifice of a dead American soldier. Mark opened the folder and slid a printed military casualty report across the marble counter. I looked down at the official government seal and the grainy black and white photograph of a young smiling man in a pristine army uniform. His first name was Terrence, but his last name was Miller. Specialist Terrence Miller was a real combat medic deployed to the exact region of Sudan my brother claimed to have been. The official report attached to his photograph detailed the tragic end of his life. Specialist Miller was caught in a brutal, violent crossfire while treating a wounded civilian child. He threw his body over the boy, taking a fatal bullet to the chest. He died an actual verified hero exactly 3 years ago. My brother had somehow stumbled upon this tragic news story during his luxury vacation in Mexico. He realized he shared the exact same first name as the deceased hero. He meticulously memorized the specific details of the ambush, the location of the field hospital, and the exact circumstances of the heroic sacrifice. He stole a dead man's honorable legacy and grafted it directly onto his own pathetic life to scam our family and our church out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a severe federal crime of the highest order. It was also deeply morally bankrupt in a way I could barely comprehend. I grabbed the federal documents, my hands trembling with absolute fury. I told Mark I was going to end this charade right now. I could not take this information directly to the local police yet because we desperately needed to secure my business from his planted evidence threat first. But I knew exactly who needed to see this file immediately. I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to my Aunt Beatrice. Aunt Beatrice was my mother's older sister and the highly respected senior secretary of our family church. She was the absolute matriarch of the extended family, the woman who organized the choir and meticulously kept the church financial ledgers. She was a strict, uncompromising woman who valued absolute truth and deeply hated liars. More importantly, she was the only family member who had ever shown me genuine kindness when my mother blatantly favored Terrence. I knew without a doubt that if I showed her the official Department of Defense records, she would instantly stop the church from writing those massive charity checks. She would force my mother to face the terrifying reality of what her son truly was. I pulled up to her neatly manicured lawn and hurried up the long brick walkway, clutching the manila folder tightly against my chest. The porch light flicked on, illuminating the dark yard, and Aunt Beatrice opened the heavy wooden front door. She was wearing her thick reading glasses and a heavy knitted shawl against the evening chill. But the warm, welcoming smile I desperately expected to see was completely absent. Instead, her face was pulled incredibly tight into a mask of profound pity and deep disappointment. She did not even unlatch the metal security screen door to let me inside her home. I held up the thick folder and pleaded with her to look at what I had found. I frantically told her I had official government military records proving Terrence stole the identity of a deceased army medic. I told her the entire charity was a massive international scam, and he was threatening to maliciously destroy my business to keep me quiet. Aunt Beatrice just shook her head slowly, refusing to even glance at the papers in my hand. She spoke to me in a soft, patronizing tone, normally reserved for a deeply confused child. She quietly said, "Terrence already warned them this would happen." I froze completely, caught off guard by her words. I asked her what on earth she meant. She sighed heavily, resting her hand on the metal frame of the locked screen door. She patiently explained that Terrence had spent the entire afternoon calling every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in the family directory. He systematically told them all with fake crying and a trembling voice that the sudden stress of his return had triggered a severe mental breakdown in me. He explicitly warned the entire family that I was becoming dangerously paranoid and maliciously jealous of his new charity work. He told them I was actively hiring shady private investigators to desperately forge fake government documents just to destroy his spotless reputation. He had completely poisoned the well before I could even draw a single drop of water. I begged Aunt Beatrice to just look at the official federal seals printed on the paper. I swore to her on my actual life that I was telling the absolute truth, but she simply looked at me with cold, sad eyes. She told me to go home and seek professional psychiatric help immediately before I completely ruined my beautiful marriage. Then she slowly stepped back and closed the heavy wooden door, firmly locking the brass deadbolt right in my face. I stood completely alone on the dark, silent porch, feeling a suffocating wave of pure panic wash over my entire body. I pulled out my cell phone and frantically dialed my older cousin Marcus, hoping anyone, would listen to simple logic. The call went straight to an automated voicemail message without a single ring. I tried calling my Uncle George next, straight to voicemail again. I stood under the porch light, quickly scrolling through my massive contact list, dialing every single family member who had attended the banquet the night before. Every single call was instantly rejected by the network. The terrifying, isolating reality finally crashed down on me heavily. Terrence had not just manipulated their wallets. He had successfully orchestrated a complete and total family excommunication. Every single person sharing my bloodline had officially blocked my number. I was entirely, completely alone against a highly dangerous criminal. I walked slowly back to my car, my legs feeling like they were made of solid lead. The drive back to my house was a dark blur of passing streetlights and empty roads. When I finally walked through my own front door, Mark was sitting on the living room sofa waiting up for me. I collapsed next to him, completely emotionally exhausted, and told him exactly what happened at Aunt Beatrice's house. I told him how Terrence had methodically called every single family member to poison them against me before I could even present the federal evidence. Mark pulled me close, letting me cry out the sheer frustration of being completely cut off from my own bloodline. He promised me that science does not care about family gossip, and the forensic evidence would eventually speak the absolute truth. We finally went to sleep completely unaware that my brother was already putting the next terrifying phase of his plan into motion. The very next morning, the sudden shrill ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet peace of our bedroom. I rolled over and squinted at the bright screen. It was my mother, Gloria. My stomach instantly dropped into a cold knot. After the brutal argument at my boutique and the mass family block the night before, I fully expected this call to be another vicious threat. I sat up in bed, took a deep breath, and answered the phone without saying a word. I did not need to speak because my mother was already screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. Her voice was completely hysterical, a chaotic mix of pure terror and blinding rage that forced me to pull the phone away from my ear. She was hyperventilating, sobbing violently, and screaming my name over and over again. I demanded to know what was going on, trying to cut through her massive panic. She screamed that Terrence was in the hospital. She cried that his downtown luxury apartment had been violently attacked in the middle of the night. According to her, chaotic, sobbing, heavily armed men wearing dark masks had kicked down his front door. She claimed they brutally beat him and ransacked his entire apartment looking for his charity financial records. Terrence had supposedly told the police that these violent men were dangerous political enemies from overseas. He claimed they were ruthless international assassins sent by the rebel warlords he had bravely defied during his time in the Sudanese desert. He told my mother that these imaginary assassins had tracked him all the way back to Chicago to silence him forever. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed listening to this absolutely ridiculous action movie script pouring out of my mother's mouth. It was so clearly completely fabricated, but my mother believed every single absurd word of it. Then her terror instantly turned into a vicious weapon pointed directly at me. "This is entirely your fault, Jordan," she screamed, her voice cracking with raw hatred. "Your stupid, petty witch hunt caused this. You have been running around the city asking dangerous questions and digging into his charity. You drew absolute massive attention to him. You brought these ruthless people right to his front door. If my beautiful son dies in that hospital bed, his blood is completely on your hands. You are a monster, and I will never forgive you." She slammed the phone down, instantly disconnecting the call before I could even process the insane accusation. I dropped my phone onto the bed, completely sick to my stomach. Terrence was escalating his massive lie. He felt the intense heat of Mark investigating his stolen valor and the fake charity accounts, so he intentionally staged a violent home invasion to gain ultimate public sympathy and completely silence my investigation. If everyone believed he was the tragic victim of an international assassination attempt, no one would ever dare question his fake military record or his missing charity funds. He was brilliantly playing the ultimate victim card to protect his lucrative scam. Just as I was explaining the terrifying phone call to Mark, his official federal-issued pager went off on the nightstand. Mark grabbed the device and read the incoming text message. His entire professional demeanor shifted in an instant. His jaw clenched tight and his eyes went completely cold. The local police department had immediately escalated the apartment break-in to the Major Crimes Division because it involved a supposed high-profile military veteran and potential international terrorism. Mark was the senior forensic investigator on call for the federal task force this weekend. They were officially dispatching him directly to Terrence's apartment to process the violent crime scene. Mark quickly strapped on his duty belt and grabbed his heavy silver forensic equipment case. He looked at me with absolute intense focus. He told me to stay inside the house, lock every single door, and not speak to anyone from my family. He promised he would call me the exact second he had the chance. I watched him drive away, feeling a strange mix of deep anxiety and sudden hope. Terrence thought he was a brilliant criminal mastermind, but he had just invited a veteran forensic expert directly into his own staged crime scene. I spent the next 4 hours anxiously pacing the length of my living room. I turned on the local morning news and watched in absolute disgust as the reporters were already broadcasting live outside my brother's apartment building. They were breathlessly reporting the tragic story of a local war hero being viciously attacked in his own home. The public narrative was already spinning completely out of control, exactly the way Terrence had planned it. The entire city was pouring their hearts and their wallets out for him. Finally, right at noon, my cell phone rang. It was Mark. I answered immediately, my heart pounding against my ribs, asking him what he found. The background noise on the call was completely silent, meaning Mark had stepped away from the busy police officers to speak to me privately. When he spoke, his voice was incredibly grim, but laced with a sharp, undeniable edge of professional triumph. He called me from right inside Terrence's shattered living room. Mark took a deep breath and delivered the news. "Jordan," he said quietly, "he messed up. He messed up really badly. The apartment is completely destroyed. There is broken glass and overturned furniture everywhere. But he does not understand the basic science of human trauma. He claimed 2 massive men beat him repeatedly in the center of the living room before he bravely fought them off. But the blood spatter on the walls and the floor does not match his dramatic story at all. There is absolutely no cast-off pattern on the ceiling from a violent struggle. There are no high-velocity impact droplets from a sudden blunt force attack. The only blood in this entire room is pooled perfectly in a single location near the bathroom sink. It is entirely consistent with a self-inflicted wound. He did not get attacked by international assassins, Jordan. He cut himself and staged this entire room. I have the concrete scientific proof right here in my hands. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. Mark had the physical evidence. The entire assassination story was a desperate theatrical production. I told Mark to secure the scene and document every single microscopic detail before Terrence's highly paid lawyers could somehow spin the narrative. I hung up the phone, grabbed my keys, and sprinted out the front door. I drove straight to the downtown hospital where they had taken my brother. The drive was a blur of blaring sirens and aggressive city traffic. When I pulled up to the massive hospital complex, the scene outside was absolute chaos. Several local news vans were already parked haphazardly along the curbs, with their giant broadcasting antennas fully extended into the gray sky. Reporters were actively harassing the hospital security guards, trying desperately to get a quote about the injured war hero. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders, kept my head down, and slipped through a side entrance used by the medical staff. I navigated the stark white hallways, following the bright overhead signs, directing me toward the intensive care unit on the fourth floor. My heart was pounding fiercely in my chest, but it was not out of fear for my brother. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline fueled by the absolute certainty that his massive house of cards was finally collapsing. I pushed through the heavy double doors leading into the intensive care waiting area. The room was unnervingly quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors echoing from the nearby patient rooms. And right there, standing perfectly in the center of the waiting room, was my mother, Gloria. She was surrounded by two sympathetic hospital social workers and a local police officer. She was playing the role of the devastated, grieving mother to absolute perfection. She held a damp tissue crushed against her face, sobbing dramatically about how the city failed to protect her precious decorated son. But the very second her tear-filled eyes locked onto me, stepping into the room, her entire demeanor shifted instantly. The tragic victim act vanished completely, replaced by a flash of pure, vicious hostility. She abruptly dismissed the social workers and the police officer, claiming she needed a private family moment. The moment the heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving us entirely alone in the sterile hallway, my mother charged directly at me. She did not yell or scream this time. Instead, she closed the distance between us with terrifying speed and aggressively shoved both of her hands hard against my shoulders. The sudden physical impact threw me off balance, and I slammed hard against the cold plaster wall behind me. My shoulder blades hit the wall with a loud, painful thud. Before I could even raise my arms to defend myself, she stepped firmly into my personal space, pinning me against the wall, with her forearm pressed uncomfortably close to my throat. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous growl that echoed harshly in the empty corridor. I tried to push her arm away, telling her to back off and calm down, but she possessed a frantic, desperate strength. She demanded that I fix the massive disaster I had maliciously caused. She claimed Terrence was lying in a hospital bed, heavily bandaged and deeply traumatized because of my jealous meddling. And then she made her ultimate demand. She told me the hospital administration was already asking for expensive insurance deposits, and Terrence desperately needed 24-hour private armed security to protect him from the imaginary assassins who attacked him. She pressed her arm harder against my collarbone, demanding that I immediately sign over the deed to my house. She said my luxury business was entirely useless if her son was dead, and she expected my lawyer to have the real estate transfer documents ready by the end of the day. I stared at her, completely appalled by her sheer aggressive delusion. She was violently assaulting me in a hospital hallway, demanding my home to fund a fictional security detail for a criminal who intentionally cut his own arms just hours ago. Before I could formulate the words to tell her that Mark already knew the violent attack was entirely faked, the heavy wooden door of Terrence's hospital room clicked open. My mother instantly let go of my throat and jumped back immediately, smoothing down her clothes and fixing her hair to look like a concerned parent again. A young, exhausted-looking intensive care nurse stepped out into the hallway, holding a thick plastic medical clipboard. The nurse looked quickly between the two of us, clearly sensing the heavy, hostile tension in the air. The nurse addressed both of us, asking who was handling the primary administrative intake paperwork for the patient. My mother immediately stepped forward, proudly declaring herself the next of kin. The nurse sighed, handing the plastic clipboard directly toward me, instead, probably assuming I was the more rational younger relative who could handle the dense medical forms. The nurse asked me to quickly verify the basic emergency blood typing results from the lab before they authorized a potential transfusion for his self-inflicted lacerations. I took the heavy clipboard and glanced down at the top sheet of paper. The bright fluorescent hospital lights illuminated the bold black text printed across the official hospital laboratory report. I read the medical data, and my entire body suddenly froze completely solid. My eyes darted across the page, reading the bold lettering over and over again to ensure I was not hallucinating. I vividly remembered the classified military casualty report Mark had shown me just last night. The real specialist, Terrence Miller, the deceased hero my brother stole his identity from, had a highly documented military blood type of O negative. But the fresh emergency lab results printed right here on my brother's actual hospital intake chart clearly listed his verified biological blood type as AB positive. The medical science was absolutely undeniable and completely impossible to fake. The blood type on the chart did not match the blood type of the hero military records he had been using to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. I stared at the medical chart in my cold, trembling hands, feeling a massive surge of vindication wash over me. I quickly handed the heavy clipboard back to the confused nurse and mumbled an excuse about checking the insurance paperwork. My mother snatched the clipboard, eager to play her role as the primary decision-maker. I backed away, slipping my phone from my pocket and texting Mark to meet me. I watched from the corridor as my mother finished signing the forms and loudly announced she was getting coffee. The exact moment the elevator doors closed behind her, I saw Mark stride purposefully through the side doors carrying his forensic equipment case. I rushed over and quickly explained the massive discrepancy with the emergency blood type results. Mark nodded, his expression grim. He told me the physical evidence at the apartment already proved the home invasion was a hoax, but he needed to document the actual wounds to make the federal fraud case bulletproof. We quietly approached the closed door of my brother's hospital room. The hallway was momentarily clear of medical staff. Mark gently pushed the door open, and we slipped silently inside. The thick curtains were drawn tight, casting the room in deep shadows. Terrence was lying in the center of the bed, breathing in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Both of his forearms were wrapped heavily in thick, white gauze. He looked like the absolute picture of a tragic survivor, peacefully resting. But Mark and I both knew he was a desperate criminal hiding behind a massive wall of lies. Mark moved with the silent efficiency of a veteran investigator. He placed his silver metal case onto a rolling tray and snapped the heavy latches open. He bypassed the standard fingerprint kits, reaching directly for a specialized piece of electronic equipment. It was a forensic alternate light source, or ALS unit. Mark quietly explained that different chemical compounds fluoresce under specific wavelengths of ultraviolet light. Real human blood contains heavy iron hemoglobin, which absorbs ultraviolet light and appears pitch black under the special lens. But synthetic stage blood is manufactured with distinct chemical dyes, which glow brilliantly under the exact same frequency. Mark handed me a pair of tinted orange glasses and slipped a matching pair over his own eyes. He turned on the flashlight device, and a harsh, intense beam of pure violet light cut instantly through the dark room. We stepped closer, hovering the violet light directly over the thick white gauze wrapping Terrence's left arm. The bright light penetrated the thin fabric, illuminating the dark red stains, soaking through the bandages. Mark leaned in incredibly close, inspecting the edges of the visible lacerations peeking out from the gauze. He whispered quietly, pointing out the distinct physical pattern of the cuts. He explained that a genuine defensive wound from fighting an armed attacker is chaotic, deep and erratic. But the cuts on Terrence's arm were perfectly parallel, shallow and evenly spaced. Mark identified them instantly as classic hesitation marks. They were the telltale superficial cuts a person makes when mentally preparing to intentionally slice their own skin, but lacking the physical courage to cut deep. Then Mark shifted the alternate light source directly onto a large smear of dried liquid on the side of Terrence's hospital gown. I gasped quietly behind my tinted orange glasses. The dried liquid did not absorb the violet light and turn pitch black like real human blood would. Instead, the entire chemical stain fluoresced with a bright, unnatural neon orange glow. It was absolute, undeniable scientific proof. Terrence had not just cut himself with shallow hesitation marks. He had actively poured synthetic theatrical stage blood all over his apartment and his clothing to make the self-inflicted injuries look significantly more gruesome and violent. The sudden sharp click of the forensic flashlight changing frequencies echoed loudly in the quiet room. Terrence abruptly shifted on the mattress, his eyes snapping completely open in the dark. For one split second, the violet light illuminated his face, capturing his look of absolute sheer terror. He stared at Mark standing over him, holding the federal investigation equipment, and instantly realized his entire fake crime scene had been thoroughly compromised. He knew he was scientifically busted, but Terrence was a master manipulator who never broke character. Instead of confessing, he immediately weaponized the terrifying situation to his absolute maximum advantage. Terrence's eyes darted wildly toward the open door, and he slammed his unwounded hand directly onto the red emergency panic button attached to his bed rail. A deafening, high-pitched alarm instantly began blaring out in the main corridor. He scrambled backward against the headboard, knocking over the rolling tray and sending Mark's equipment crashing loudly onto the hard linoleum floor. Terrence opened his mouth and began screaming at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice echoing frantically. "Help me!" he shrieked, his face twisted into a mask of pure manufactured terror. "He is trying to kill me." He pointed a trembling finger directly at Mark, portraying the ultimate helpless victim. "My sister's white husband is trying to murder me in my hospital bed. He is trying to finish what the assassins started. Help, an African-American war hero is being attacked." The heavy wooden door to the hospital room violently burst open. 4 massive hospital security guards in dark uniforms rushed into the cramped room, followed closely by a swarm of panicked nurses and the attending physician. The bright overhead fluorescent lights flicked on, instantly blinding us. I stood frozen in shock as 2 of the guards immediately tackled Mark, forcing him aggressively against the cold cinder block wall and shouting aggressive commands. Another guard stepped directly between me and the hospital bed, placing his hand firmly on his heavy-duty radio. Terrence continued to sob hysterically, clutching his bandaged arms and pointing accusingly at us, putting on the performance of a lifetime as the entire hospital security team treated us like dangerous, violent criminals. The violent commotion in the cramped hospital room was absolute pandemonium. The 4 massive security guards had Mark securely pinned against the cinder block wall, his arms wrenched painfully behind his back. The attending physician rushed to the side of the bed, checking the loudly blaring cardiac monitors and attempting to calm my hysterically screaming brother. Terrence continued to thrash wildly against the clean white sheets, making sure everyone in the crowded room clearly saw his heavily bandaged arms. He sobbed forcefully, pointing a trembling finger directly at me as I stood frozen near the open doorway. "She brought him here," Terrence wailed, his voice cracking with perfectly manufactured terror. "My own sister brought this violent man into my secure room. They are trying to silence me because of the charity money. Please get them out of here before they kill me." The head of hospital security, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely shaved head, turned his fierce glare toward me. He aggressively ordered me to leave the hospital premises immediately or face serious criminal trespassing charges. I tried desperately to explain that Mark was a federal forensic investigator and we had concrete scientific proof that the injuries were entirely self-inflicted. But my desperate words were completely drowned out by the chaotic shouting and the blaring alarms. They physically grabbed Mark by his belt, dragging him out of the room and down the sterile hallway like a common criminal. A female security guard firmly grabbed my upper arm, and forcefully escorted me toward the service elevator. As the heavy metal doors slid shut, entirely cutting off the terrifying scene, I caught one final glimpse of my brother. The intense, terrified look on his face had completely vanished. He was staring directly at me through the narrowing gap of the elevator doors, and he gave me a slow, cold, triumphant smirk. Mark and I spent the next 4 hours sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chairs of the local police precinct. Because Mark was an active federal employee and the hospital security team could not actually prove he committed any physical assault, his immediate supervisor was able to get him released without formal charges. But the professional damage was already done. Mark was officially suspended from the active federal investigation, pending a complete internal review of the hospital incident. As we walked out of the precinct into the cold evening air, my phone began vibrating continuously in my pocket. It was a frantic barrage of notifications, text messages, and incoming calls from unknown numbers. I pulled the phone out and my stomach instantly dropped. Terrence had not wasted a single second of his newfound momentum. He had launched a massive coordinated offensive while we were completely stuck at the police station. Terrence had recorded a highly emotional, deeply disturbing video directly from his hospital bed and posted it across every major social media platform. The video was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and modern character assassination. He lay weakly against the stark white pillows wearing a thin medical gown that perfectly showcased his thick white bandages. He stared directly into the camera lens with wide, terrified eyes, his voice trembling with perfectly executed vulnerability. He claimed that my husband, Mark, a white man in a position of federal authority, had violently attacked him in his hospital bed. He accused Mark of being a dangerous, violent racist who was using his government badge to physically intimidate and silence a vulnerable African American war veteran. He claimed I was entirely complicit in this horrific abuse because I was violently jealous of his public success and his newly launched charity fund. The devastating video spread across the internet like a massive, uncontrolled wildfire. Within a matter of hours, it had racked up hundreds of thousands of views and thousands of furious comments. Local news stations picked up the dramatic clip, playing it on loop during the evening broadcasts. Terrence successfully tapped into deep-seated cultural fears and massive social anxieties, completely weaponizing them against us. He perfectly painted himself as the ultimate helpless victim of systemic abuse and family betrayal. The public backlash was immediate, terrifying, and highly coordinated. By the time I drove to my jewelry boutique the next morning, the situation had completely deteriorated. A large, angry crowd of protesters was actively swarming the front entrance of my business. They were holding up large cardboard signs demanding justice for the wounded war hero and calling for my immediate arrest. Several aggressive individuals were shouting through heavy bullhorns, completely blocking the sidewalk and intimidating my regular customers. My private security guard was frantically pacing behind the reinforced, bulletproof glass, completely overwhelmed by the chaotic mob. I parked my car in a secure alleyway a block down the street and managed to slip through the heavy, reinforced steel back door of the boutique. The moment I stepped inside, my store manager approached me with absolute terror in her eyes. She explained that our online business profile had been aggressively review-bombed overnight. Thousands of angry people who had never even set foot in the store were leaving one-star reviews, calling us violent racists, and demanding a total boycott of our business. Our primary vendors were calling non-stop, frantically trying to cancel massive wholesale diamond shipments because they were terrified of the sudden toxic association. The phone lines were ringing continuously, filling our voicemail boxes with vile, aggressive death threats. The business I had painstakingly built from absolutely nothing, the pristine sanctuary where I appraised rare diamonds and crafted beautiful custom jewelry, was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. Terrence was successfully destroying my entire life with a single viral lie, exactly as he promised he would. The sheer overwhelming magnitude of the public hatred was suffocating. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that I could not simply wait for the slow turning wheels of a suspended federal investigation to clear my name. The mob would completely destroy my livelihood long before the truth ever saw the light of day. I instructed my manager to lock down the entire store, pull down the heavy metal security gates, and send all the employees home with full pay. I sat completely alone in my dark, silent private viewing room staring at the heavy velvet display mats. The chaotic, muffled shouting of the angry protesters outside echoed faintly through the thick, bulletproof glass walls. The entire situation felt completely hopeless. Mark walked quietly into the room, his face tight with deep frustration over his federal suspension. He stood behind my chair, gently resting his hands on my tense shoulders. I looked up at him, the heavy weight of the last 48 hours pressing down on my chest. I had lost my entire extended family. My brother was publicly framing my husband for a violent hate crime, and my successful business was currently under absolute siege by an angry, manipulated mob. I took a deep, shuddering breath, closing my eyes for a brief moment. But instead of breaking down, instead of crying, or surrendering to the immense, crushing pressure, I felt a cold, sharp surge of pure, absolute determination wash over me. I am a professional gemologist. I spend my entire life examining intense pressure and looking directly for the microscopic flaws that shatter fake stones. Terrence's dramatic emotional performance was flawless, but his complex financial scam was not. I slowly opened my eyes, reached across the dark desk, and pulled my silver laptop toward me. I opened the heavy screen, casting a bright blue light across the dark room. He wants to play the ultimate victim, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, deadly serious whisper. Let us follow the money. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, letting the cool blue light wash over my exhausted face. Running a high-end jewelry boutique requires much more than just a good eye for flawless diamonds. It requires a deep, comprehensive understanding of international finance, wire transfers, corporate tax structures, and shell companies. The global diamond trade is notoriously murky, and I had spent the last decade learning exactly how to spot fraudulent vendors hiding behind layers of corporate paperwork. Terrence thought I was just a wealthy shopkeeper. He completely underestimated my absolute mastery of financial paper trails. I opened a secure web browser and navigated directly to the official state database for registered charities and nonprofit organizations. I typed the exact name of his highly publicized charity, the Sudan Relief Fund, into the search bar and pressed enter. The system returned a completely blank page. There was absolutely no registered charitable organization operating under that name anywhere within the state of Illinois. Terrence had stood on that stage at the lavish banquet, directly accepting massive donations from our church elders under the strict legal guise of a tax-deductible charitable entity. If he was not legally registered with the state attorney general, he was openly committing massive corporate fraud right in front of hundreds of people. I needed the exact employer identification number or tax ID he was using to process the incoming credit card donations. I opened a new tab and pulled up the highly emotional viral video he had posted from his hospital bed. Below the video in the description box was a direct link to a slick professional donation website. I clicked the link and scanned the bottom of the donation page, looking for the mandatory fine print. There, hidden in the tiny gray text at the very bottom of the screen, was a 9-digit federal tax identification number. I copied the number and pasted it directly into a federal corporate registry database. The search results instantly populated, filling my screen with complex registration documents. Terrence's supposed global charity was not a registered nonprofit organization at all. It was a standard limited liability company, a private LLC registered to a generic post office box in Wilmington, Delaware. Delaware is universally known in the business world as a corporate tax haven, a place where individuals can easily register anonymous shell companies to completely hide their assets and mask their true identities from public scrutiny and state tax auditors. This was not a minor administrative oversight by a traumatized war veteran. This was a highly deliberate, calculated financial maneuver designed by a professional con artist. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the quiet clicking echoing loudly in the empty security vault. I cross-referenced the Delaware LLC registration with international banking databases I used for verifying overseas diamond suppliers. Terrence had made a critical, arrogant mistake. He had linked the public donation portal directly to a third-party payment processor to handle the massive influx of credit card transactions from his viral video. Using my advanced corporate merchant account access, I was able to run a reverse search on the receiving routing numbers attached to that specific payment processor. The financial data cascaded down my screen, revealing the exact final destination of every single dollar our community had generously donated. The money was not being wired to struggling field hospitals in the harsh Sudanese desert. It was not purchasing vital medical supplies or funding emergency trauma centers. Every single penny was being automatically routed through the anonymous Delaware shell company and directly deposited into a private offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic, highly sophisticated money laundering operation designed to completely drain the community and hide the stolen funds forever. He was essentially a digital pirate actively plundering the goodwill of an entire city, while safely pretending to be a wounded, bleeding saint. I connected my laptop to the secure laser printer sitting on my desk and hit print. The machine hummed loudly, spitting out page after page of undeniable financial evidence. I gathered the warm stack of papers and began highlighting the largest incoming wire transfers listed on the payment processor ledger. I wanted to see exactly who Terrence was bleeding dry. I scanned past the numerous small donations from outraged strangers online and focused on the massive initial deposits made right after the welcome banquet. My highlighter stopped abruptly over a massive wire transfer for exactly $85,000. I recognized the originating bank immediately because it was the exact same local credit union my parents had used my entire life. I looked closer at the specific account, routing digits listed next to the massive transfer. My breath completely caught in my throat and a wave of pure, profound sickness washed over my entire body. I pulled out my phone and quickly pulled up a digital copy of an old voided check my mother had given me years ago to pay for a shared family vacation. I carefully compared the routing numbers on my phone screen to the numbers printed on the fraudulent charity ledger. They were an absolute perfect exact match. That $85,000 was not just a generous charitable donation, it was the absolute entirety of my mother's primary retirement savings account. The account she and my late father had spent 40 grueling years building dollar by single dollar was completely empty. Terrence had not just scammed the church or the angry public. He had knowingly and maliciously drained our mother's entire life, savings into an untraceable offshore account. Mama Gloria was violently defending him, aggressively, attacking me in hospital hallways, and demanding I sign over my house, all while she was secretly bankrupting herself to blindly fund his massive, luxurious lie. She was permanently destroying her own future just to keep his sick fantasy alive. He had successfully stolen her absolute security, and she thanked him. It was completely devastating to see. I sat completely paralyzed, staring at the printed ledger showing my mother's entirely depleted retirement fund. The heavy wooden door to my private office clicked open, and Mark walked back into the room holding 2 cups of black coffee. He took one look at my devastated face and immediately set the cups down on the glass counter. He hurried around the desk and looked over my shoulder at the highlighted banking documents. I pointed a trembling finger at the $85,000 wire transfer and softly explained that Terrence had completely wiped out her life savings. Mark leaned in incredibly close, his eyes scanning the fraudulent routing numbers. His jaw clenched so tightly a visible muscle ticked in his cheek. He told me that stealing from strangers is a federal felony, but actively bankrupting his own mother is a completely different level of pure evil. He pulled up a chair sitting directly beside me and gently took the laptop from my hands. He said if Terrence is moving this massive amount of money into a Cayman Islands offshore account, he is definitely not just letting it sit there collecting dust. He is actively spending it, and massive expenditures always leave a highly visible digital footprint. Mark was officially suspended from his federal field office, But his brilliant investigative mind did not require a government badge to expose a sloppy criminal. He seamlessly took over the keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision. He utilized a complex network of open-source international property databases and global wire tracing software he had mastered over his long career. We sat in the dark, silent jewelry boutique for 3 grueling hours, meticulously tracking every single outgoing penny from that offshore account. The Cayman account was acting as a massive financial funnel, automatically distributing the stolen charity funds into several different international holding companies. But one specific recurring payment immediately caught Mark's highly trained eye. It was a massive monthly wire transfer of $12,000 being sent directly to a high-end luxury real estate escrow firm located in Baja California, Sur Mexico. Mark ran the escrow firm through a specialized property registry database. Within minutes, the official Mexican real estate deed loaded onto our bright screen. The stolen charity money and my mother's retirement funds were actively paying the massive mortgage on a spectacular $3 million beachfront villa located in the highly exclusive resort town of Cabo San Lucas. The property featured a private infinity pool, massive oceanfront balconies, and a dedicated slip at the local luxury yacht marina. Terrence was not building trauma centers in the harsh desert. He was building a tropical paradise for himself, using money stolen from our generous community. But the most shocking revelation was printed right at the absolute bottom of the official property deed. The luxury beachfront villa was not registered solely in my brother's name. It was legally co-signed by a woman named Vanessa Sterling. I stared at the unfamiliar name, completely confused. I asked Mark who this woman was. Mark quickly ran her name through a comprehensive background check database. The results populated almost instantly, completely shattering another massive layer of Terrence's endless lies. Vanessa Sterling was legally registered as Terrence's active spouse. They had been officially married in a quiet civil ceremony in Las Vegas nearly 4 years ago. My brother had a secret wife. He had completely hidden an entire marriage from our family, our church, and his supposed charity donors. He intentionally maintained his public image as a tragic, lonely single man to maximize the emotional sympathy and the financial donations he received from unsuspecting older women in our community. Mark did not stop there. He knew that luxury properties and exclusive international marinas are heavily monitored by high-definition security networks and local social media tagging. He cross-referenced the specific marina slip attached to Terrence's villa and began pulling up public social media posts tagged at that exact geographical location over the past year. He filtered the search results, focusing specifically on the exact month Terrence claimed he was brutally ambushed and held hostage by dangerous rebel forces in Sudan. According to the heroic story he told at the banquet, he spent that entire month trapped in a dark dirt floor prison cell, fighting for his life and suffering horrific physical abuse. The computer screen buffered for a few seconds before loading a crystal-clear high-definition video, uploaded by a luxury yacht charter company based in Cabo San Lucas. The promotional video was specifically dated right in the absolute middle of Terrence's supposed horrific captivity in Africa. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. The video showed a massive, multi-million-dollar yacht sailing smoothly across the bright blue ocean waters. A large group of people was dancing on the sun deck, holding expensive bottles of champagne. Right there in the absolute center of the frame, surrounded by cheering friends and wearing designer sunglasses, was my brother Terrence. He was standing with his arms wrapped tightly around the beautiful woman who had to be his secret wife, Vanessa. I watched in absolute horrified fascination as Terrence laughed loudly, throwing his head back in pure joy. He was not bleeding or broken. He was not starving in a desert prison. He was walking around the moving deck of the luxury yacht with absolute perfect balance, showing absolutely no signs of the severe physical trauma or the lingering combat limp he constantly displayed for his sympathetic audience back home in Chicago. He was heavily tanned, extremely healthy, and aggressively partying on a boat, paid for by the tears and the emptied wallets of our generous community. Mark paused the video right on my brother's laughing face. We now had the absolute undeniable visual proof of his massive international fraud. The fake hero was officially dead. Mark and I sat in the dark, silent jewelry boutique, letting the massive reality of the Cabo yacht video completely sink in. The fake hero was officially dead. We finally had the absolute, physical, undeniable proof we desperately needed to completely destroy his entire fabricated life. I closed the silver laptop, sliding the printed banking ledgers, the offshore property deeds, and the digital video files into a secure, waterproof folder. Mark quietly packed up his heavy forensic equipment case, and we exited through the reinforced steel back door of the boutique. We left the angry, manipulated mob shouting blindly at the empty, bulletproof front windows, completely unaware that they were aggressively defending a tropical vacationing fraud. The drive back to our house through the dark city streets was incredibly quiet, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of defeat and isolation. It was the sharp, intensely focused silence of two professionals meticulously preparing for an absolute war. We pulled into our quiet suburban driveway, and the motion sensor security lights immediately flooded the entire front yard with a harsh, bright white light. Standing right there on our front porch, perfectly illuminated by the intense security spotlights, was my mother, Gloria. She was clutching a thick, heavy manila envelope tightly against her chest. She did not look anything like the weeping, terrified mother who had violently assaulted me in the hospital hallway just yesterday. She stood incredibly tall, her chin raised high in a posture of absolute supreme arrogance and righteous victory. Mark put the car in park and unbuckled his seatbelt, his jaw clenching so tight, a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He reached for his door handle, but I placed my hand firmly on his arm. I told him to stay in the car and let me handle her directly. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked slowly up the concrete pathway toward the front porch. The cold night wind whipped aggressively around us, but my mother did not even shiver. She just stared down at me with cold, dead eyes. I stopped at the bottom of the wooden porch steps and calmly asked her what she was doing at my house so late at night. She did not bother with a standard greeting or any fake maternal warmth. She simply reached into the heavy manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents securely bound by a dark blue legal cover. She thrust the papers directly toward my face, holding them out like a weapon. She coldly stated that she was officially delivering a formal notice of default, an impending property foreclosure. I stared at her, completely confused by her aggressive, ridiculous words. I told her my house was completely paid off 5 years ago, and there was absolutely no mortgage to default on. My mother smiled, a cold, vicious smile that sent a sudden, chilling shiver directly down my spine. She proudly announced that there is a massive mortgage on it now. She explained her horrific actions with absolute chilling pride. She stated that since I was an incredibly selfish and deeply ungrateful daughter who absolutely refused to financially help my own dying brother, she was forced to take matters into her own hands to save his precious life. She proudly admitted that she took out a massive, high-interest personal loan against the entire equity of my house, using my private property as the primary financial collateral. I stood completely frozen on the bottom step, trying desperately to mentally process the absolute sheer insanity of her confession. I told her that was legally impossible because my name is the absolute only name listed on the official county property deed. I asked her how she could possibly convince a legitimate bank to let her take out a massive loan against a house she does not legally own. My mother rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet suburban neighborhood. She stated that Terrence is an incredibly brilliant man who knows exactly how to navigate the complex legal system to get things done. She explained that Terrence had his private financial advisors draw up the aggressive loan paperwork while he was lying in his hospital bed. She then casually confessed that she simply signed my name on the dotted line. She freely admitted to blatantly forging my legal signature on highly sensitive binding financial documents, and she said it with the absolute casual pride of a mother bragging about her child winning a simple spelling bee. She claimed the private lenders instantly wired $300,000 directly into Terrence's secure recovery account. She then smugly informed me that the massive monthly loan payments were entirely my legal responsibility. She added that since the first massive payment was already intentionally overdue, the aggressive private lenders were legally starting the eviction process tomorrow morning. She demanded I pack my bags and leave the property so they could sell the house to cover her son's fabricated medical bills. She honestly believed she had brilliantly cornered me in an inescapable trap. She truly thought she had successfully stolen my entire home to continuously fund his massive criminal empire and left me with absolutely no legal recourse. But instead of breaking down, instead of crying or panicking like she desperately wanted me to, I felt a massive wave of absolute cold clarity wash over my entire body. I did not yell or scream at her. I simply looked at the forged legal documents in her hand and realized the massive fatal mistake they had just arrogantly made. By bringing aggressive private lenders' forged real estate deeds and massive interstate wire transfers into this messy family drama, Terrence had officially crossed a massive legal boundary. He had escalated his greedy scam from a local state-level charity fraud directly into a massive federal wire fraud and severe real estate felony. The federal government does not care about family gossip, but they absolutely destroy people who forge signatures to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars through interstate banking channels. I looked directly into my mother's proud, defiant eyes, feeling absolutely zero pity for the devastating storm she had just unleashed upon herself. I kept my voice incredibly low and deadly calm. I told her she thought she was saving him, but she just handed the federal government the absolute exact evidence they desperately needed to lock him away forever. "You just signed your golden boy's prison sentence," I whispered. My mother stood frozen on the bottom step of the porch, trying desperately to comprehend the severe legal threat I had just whispered in the cold night air. I watched her eyes widen in sudden confusion and a brief flash of genuine panic. But before she could fully process the massive federal implications of her forged signature, I knew I had to immediately change my entire strategy. If I aggressively spooked them right now, Terrence might instantly drain the offshore Cayman account and flee the country before Mark could officially secure the federal warrants. I needed to trap him completely. I needed him feeling absolutely untouchable and supremely confident, so he would willingly walk right into a massive public trap. So I instantly let my shoulders slump forward. I dropped my defensive posture and I forced hot tears to well up in my eyes. I let out a loud, dramatic sob and buried my face in my trembling hands. I cried out, telling my mother I was just so completely overwhelmed and terrified of losing absolutely everything I had built. I begged for her immediate forgiveness. I claimed the immense stress of the angry protest mob surrounding my boutique had finally broken my spirit. I told her she was absolutely right, and I was a terrible, selfish sister who was just paranoid and confused. My mother instantly softened her arrogant posture, melting completely back into the comforting superior matriarch, now that she believed she had successfully dominated me. She reached out and patted my shoulder with a condescending smile, telling me I was finally coming to my senses and acting like a proper member of the family. I wiped my fake tears and told her I desperately wanted to make things right in the biggest way possible. I knew Terrence was scheduled to be officially discharged from the hospital the very next morning to prepare for the massive City Hero Gala the local mayor was throwing in his honor at the end of the week. I promised my mother I would drive over to his luxury apartment tomorrow afternoon to formally apologize to him in person and offer a massive financial contribution to his recovery fund. The next afternoon, I walked into Terrence's downtown apartment building. The broken glass and overturned furniture from his poorly staged break-in had already been completely cleaned up and replaced by expensive new decor. He was lounging casually on a plush white leather sofa, wearing expensive silk pajamas, with his arms still dramatically wrapped in thick white medical gauze. My mother was happily hovering over him, eagerly arranging a tray of gourmet food and pouring him fresh juice. When I walked into the living room, Terrence did not even bother to sit up or acknowledge my presence. He just looked at me with absolute sheer contempt, his dark eyes shining with arrogant victory. I played my pathetic part perfectly. I kept my head bowed low, my hands clasped nervously in front of me, and my voice shaking with manufactured shame. I told him I was incredibly sorry for doubting his horrific, heroic story. To really sell the elaborate lie, I claimed that Mark had manipulated my thoughts because he was secretly jealous of Terrence's military glory and massive public adoration. I told Terrence my jewelry business was completely dying because of his viral hospital video, and I desperately needed to publicly clear my name before I was forced into total bankruptcy. I offered him a highly lucrative deal that I knew his greedy ego could never possibly resist. I promised to present him with a certified cashier check for $250,000 directly on the main stage at his upcoming City Hero Gala. I explained my reasoning with perfect submissive logic. I told him that giving him a massive public donation in front of the local news cameras would instantly prove to the entire city that our family was completely united and healed. It would immediately call off the angry internet mob currently attacking my boutique, and more importantly, it would give his newly launched charity the ultimate legitimate backing it desperately needed to attract even wealthier donors in the audience. It was a massive financial win for his greedy ego, and it required absolutely zero effort on his part. Terrence listened silently to my desperate plea, and a slow, sickeningly triumphant smile spread across his handsome face. He looked over at our mother, who was nodding proudly at my absolute total submission. Terrence threw his head back and laughed a dark, mocking sound that made my skin crawl with pure disgust. He told me it was about damn time I learned my absolute proper place in this family hierarchy. He gloated openly that he had completely crushed my arrogant, independent spirit in less than a single week. He happily accepted my desperate offer of $250,000, acting as if the massive fortune was merely his rightful required tax for having to deal with my annoying existence. But simply taking my money was never enough for his massive, fragile ego. He deeply needed to physically and mentally humiliate me as well. He looked me up and down with deep theatrical disgust. He commanded me to attend the gala to deliver the money, but he strictly dictated exactly how I should appear. He explicitly demanded that I wear the absolute cheapest, plainest dress I owned in my closet. He told me I was strictly forbidden to wear any of my fancy, expensive jewelry or professionally style my hair. He wanted me to look exactly like the pathetic, beaten dog I truly was, so I would not dare pull any attention away from his glorious, heroic moment in the massive public spotlight. I stood there silently listening to his vile, narcissistic demands, while my mother smiled in warm agreement from the kitchen counter. I did not argue with him or fight back to defend my dignity. I simply nodded my head and offered him a very tight, perfectly controlled smile. I told him he did not need to worry about my appearance at the event at all. I promised him I would wear exactly what I wore the day he started this massive lie. I walked out of his luxury apartment building and stepped into the cool evening air, feeling a profound sense of absolute clarity. Mark was waiting for me in our parked car down the street. I opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, handing him the heavy manila envelope my mother had proudly given me the night before. Mark pulled the forged real estate documents out of the envelope and reviewed the fraudulent loan agreements. He looked at the signature line where my mother had completely fabricated my handwriting to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. He shook his head in pure disbelief, stating that they had literally handed us the exact murder weapon with their own fingerprints still fresh on the handle. We drove straight back to our house and spent the entire night assembling the ultimate federal dossier. We laid every single piece of evidence out across our large dining room table. We had the classified military casualty report proving the stolen valor of the deceased medic. We had the glowing violet photographs of the fake theatrical blood from his staged apartment break-in. We had the printed offshore banking ledgers from the Cayman Islands and the Mexican property deed co-signed by his secret wife. And now we had the massive forged mortgage documents proving severe interstate wire fraud. Early the next morning, Mark made a highly secure phone call. Even though he was officially suspended from his field office, he still possessed deep, unshakable relationships with senior federal agents who absolutely trusted his forensic instincts. He called a veteran FBI special agent named Davis and a senior investigator from the IRS Criminal Division. Mark explicitly told them he had a massive active wire fraud and stolen valor case that required immediate federal intervention. Because of the overwhelming physical evidence we had meticulously compiled, they agreed to an emergency meeting off the official books. We drove to the heavily fortified federal building downtown and passed through multiple layers of armed security. We were escorted into a stark windowless conference room deep inside the federal complex. Agent Davis and the IRS investigator were already waiting for us at a large steel table. Mark did not waste any time with pleasantries. He opened his heavy silver case and began systematically laying out the undeniable physical proof of my brother's massive criminal empire. He walked the federal agents through every single lie. He showed them the fake charity registration, the offshore shell company in Delaware, and the high-definition video of Terrence partying on a luxury yacht in Cabo San Lucas, while claiming to be a tortured hostage. The IRS agent meticulously reviewed the financial ledgers, calculating the massive influx of stolen community donations and the fraudulent real estate loan my mother had illegally secured. The numbers climbed rapidly. Between the fake charity funds, the stolen retirement accounts, and the massive forged mortgage, the total amount of verifiable financial fraud easily exceeded $1.5 million. Agent Davis leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He stated that crossing the $1.5 million threshold immediately elevated the crime from a simple local scam to a top-tier priority federal investigation. Terrence was no longer just a family nuisance, he was a highly lucrative target for the United States Department of Justice. The agents completely agreed that Terrence needed to be stopped immediately before he could completely drain the accounts and flee across the border to his Mexican villa. Mark proposed a highly coordinated public sting operation. Since Terrence was officially expecting me to hand him a certified cashier check for $250,000 on live television at the massive City Hero Gala, it presented the absolute perfect opportunity. Accepting those funds publicly while representing a fraudulent charity would provide the federal agents with the ultimate undeniable real-time evidence to execute an immediate high-profile arrest. Agent Davis agreed to the sting operation, confirming he would have undercover federal agents positioned throughout the entire gala ballroom. The plan was completely set, but there was one final severe administrative hurdle left to cross. Agent Davis gathered the massive stack of forged real estate documents and looked directly across the steel table at me. His expression was incredibly serious and filled with heavy professional caution. He slid a formal federal affidavit across the table and placed a black pen on top of the crisp white paper. He looked me in the eyes and warned me with absolute brutal honesty about what this specific document truly meant. He explained that by signing this sworn legal affidavit, I was officially authorizing the federal government to aggressively prosecute every single individual involved in the massive financial fraud. Agent Davis lowered his voice, telling me he knew Gloria was my biological mother. He warned me that the forensic evidence clearly proved she had actively forged my signature to illegally secure the massive mortgage loan. He stated that even if she was completely brainwashed by Terrence, the federal law absolutely does not care about toxic family dynamics. If the FBI raids that gala and arrests my brother, my mother will immediately face severe felony charges for aggressively aiding and abetting a massive federal wire fraud. She will lose absolutely everything, and she will face significant prison time. He asked me if I was entirely sure I wanted to pull the trigger, knowing it would completely destroy my own mother. I looked down at the federal affidavit sitting on the cold steel table. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, and the endless toxic favoritism. I thought about how she violently pinned me against a hospital wall and aggressively demanded my home to protect a criminal. I thought about how she proudly bragged about stealing my property and told me to pack my bags. I did not feel a single drop of hesitation or regret. I picked up the black pen and smoothly signed my full legal name at the bottom of the federal document. I pushed the paper back across the table, looking the FBI agent directly in the eyes. I kept my voice incredibly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. If she chose his lies, I said coldly, she can share his cell. The remainder of the week moved with a terrifying speed. Mark and the federal agents meticulously planned every single detail of the upcoming sting operation, while I went to work and pretended my entire world was not about to violently explode. When Friday evening finally arrived, the atmosphere in the city was completely electric. The highly anticipated City Hero Gala was being held at the grand ballroom of the most prestigious hotel in downtown Chicago. Mark drove us to the venue in absolute silence. The massive hotel came into view, and the front entrance was an absolute circus. Valet attendants were sprinting back and forth, while local news crews aggressively jockeyed for the best camera positions along the red carpet. We stepped out of the car and walked past the flashing camera bulbs. I kept my head down, ignoring the reporters shouting questions about my brother. I had kept my strict promise to Terrence. I was wearing the absolute cheapest, most incredibly plain dress I owned. I wore absolutely zero jewelry. My neck and wrists were completely bare. I did not wear any makeup, and I simply tied my hair back into a severe tight bun. Next to the wealthy donors draped in expensive silk and sparkling diamonds, I looked exactly like the pathetic, defeated woman my brother desperately wanted the world to see. Mark walked closely beside me, wearing a sharp, dark suit. He looked incredibly calm, but I knew he was actively scanning the massive crowd, identifying the undercover federal agents strategically positioned near the exits and disguised as hotel catering staff. We pushed through the heavy gilded doors and entered the massive ballroom. The sheer scale of the event was absolutely nauseating. The elegant venue was decorated with stunning floral arrangements and long tables covered in crisp white linen. Politicians, local celebrities, and wealthy business owners were mingling happily, completely unaware they were funding an international criminal right. In the absolute center of the room, surrounded by a massive crowd of adoring fans, stood my brother. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, looking incredibly handsome and thoroughly enjoying the massive spotlight. Before we could even reach our assigned table, my mother Gloria intercepted us. She aggressively pushed her way through the crowd of wealthy donors, leaving a trail of heavy, expensive perfume in her wake. I looked at her and felt a sharp, deep stab of pure disgust. She was wearing a breathtakingly expensive silver designer gown, dripping in intricate hand-sewn crystals. She was literally wearing the stolen charity money and her own completely drained retirement fund. She strutted directly up to me, completely ignoring Mark, and looked me up and down with absolute open contempt. She laughed loudly, intentionally, drawing the attention of our extended family members standing nearby. Aunt Beatrice and my cousins turned to look at us, their faces completely tight with lingering judgment and disapproval. "Look at you," my mother mocked, her voice echoing sharply over the gentle background music. "You actually listened to him for once." She turned to Aunt Beatrice, gesturing dramatically toward my plain faded dress. "It is incredibly fitting. Do you not think, Beatrice? She is finally showing the proper respect for her brother, the hero of our family." Aunt Beatrice simply nodded her head, giving me a cold, distant look of profound pity. The rest of the cousins whispered quietly among themselves, completely buying into the narrative that I was a broken, jealous woman, finally submitting to my powerful brother. I did not defend myself. I simply kept my eyes cast down and offered her a weak, trembling smile, playing my pathetic role to absolute perfection. I told her I brought the certified cashier check exactly as promised, and I was fully prepared to give it to him on stage. My mother clapped her hands together in pure, greedy delight. She proudly patted my cheek with a cold, heavy hand and told me I was finally being a good girl. The bright overhead chandeliers suddenly dimmed, casting the massive ballroom into a soft, intimate darkness. A single brilliant spotlight snapped on, illuminating the grand stage at the front of the room. The mayor of Chicago. A tall, charismatic man with silver hair walked confidently up to the crystal podium. He adjusted the microphone and looked out over the massive sea of wealthy donors. Ladies and gentlemen, the mayor began, his deep voice echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system. Tonight, we are gathered to honor true selfless bravery. We are here to celebrate a man who faced the absolute darkest terrors of war and emerged with a pure heart dedicated to helping others. He spoke passionately for several minutes, recounting Terrence's completely fabricated story of surviving a brutal rebel ambush in the harsh Sudanese desert. The audience was completely captivated. Several people sitting at the tables near me were openly wiping tears from their eyes. "It is my absolute highest honor," the mayor announced, his voice rising in dramatic crescendo, "to present the official key to the city to our very own hometown hero. Please welcome to the stage the founder of the Sudan Relief Fund, Terrence Miller." The entire ballroom erupted into a massive standing ovation. The applause was absolutely deafening. Terrence stood up from his front row table, waving humbly to the cheering crowd. He walked slowly up the stage steps, perfectly faking his slight tragic limp. The mayor enthusiastically shook his hand and handed him a large ceremonial golden key. He looked out over the massive sea of adoring faces, flashing a practiced smile. Terrence stepped up to the microphone, bathing in the absolute peak of his fraudulent glory. "And now," the mayor continued, beaming proudly at my brother, "we have a very special surprise addition to our program tonight. True heroes are forged by the love of their family. To present a massive charitable contribution and deliver a special, sisterly tribute. Please welcome his sister Jordan to the stage." I took a deep breath and stepped out from the shadows of my table, walking slowly toward the brightly lit stage. Every single eye in the massive grand ballroom was locked completely onto me. My cheap faded dress felt incredibly heavy against my skin, but I wore it like a suit of impenetrable armor. I walked past the front row where my mother Gloria was sitting. Her face was practically glowing with toxic triumph. She offered me a condescending nod, fully believing that she had finally broken my independent spirit and forced me to publicly submit to her golden child. I climbed the carpeted stairs to the main stage, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped, playing the role of the defeated sister right up until the absolute final second. The mayor smiled warmly and handed me the heavy silver microphone, stepping back to give me the floor. Terrence was standing just a few feet away from me, his arms wrapped in crisp white medical gauze. He looked down at me with a sickeningly smug expression, completely ready to accept my $250,000 check and my public apology. I wrapped both of my hands around the microphone and looked out over the sea of wealthy donors, politicians, and local news cameras. The silence in the room was absolute. I raised my head, and for the first time all evening, I pulled my shoulders back and stood completely straight. I looked directly into the bright camera lenses and began my speech. I started by talking about the profound, heavy concept of truth and the ultimate price of human sacrifice. I told the captivated audience that we live in a world where people constantly wear masks to hide their true intentions. I said that true heroism is not defined by the loud, dramatic stories we tell in crowded rooms, but by the quiet, hidden actions we take when no one else is watching. I spoke about how my brother Terrence had shown our family his absolute true colors over the past few months. I said he had taught me an unforgettable lesson about exactly what it means to take from the community and what it means to survive. The audience was completely silent, hanging on to every single word I spoke. They believed I was delivering a beautiful poetic tribute to a traumatized war veteran. Terrence puffed his chest out proudly, leaning heavily on his cane and soaking in the massive public adoration. My mother was wiping away a single dramatic tear in the front row, completely blind to the trap that was rapidly closing around them. I turned my body slightly so I was facing Terrence directly. I looked right into his arrogant eyes, and I let a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. I told him that words and money were simply not enough to truly honor his specific type of sacrifice. I announced to the massive ballroom that I had prepared a very special visual presentation to show the entire city exactly who Terrence really was and exactly what he was doing during his horrific month of captivity in the desert. Terrence smiled graciously, fully expecting a highly produced slideshow of his staged promotional photographs from the fake refugee camp. I turned my attention to the back of the massive ballroom and gave a sharp, clear nod directly to the darkened audiovisual control booth. Mark had visited the hotel technical director an hour before the gala began, presenting his federal credentials and completely taking over the main projection system. The bright overhead chandeliers immediately faded into total darkness. A massive high-definition projection screen slowly lowered from the ceiling, right behind the main stage. The audience leaned forward eagerly, anticipating a heartwarming documentary tribute. The heavy silence was suddenly shattered by the loud booming sound of aggressive tropical dance music echoing through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. The massive screen flared to life, but it did not show a dusty, war-torn desert or a tragic field hospital. It displayed crystal-clear, high-definition footage of a luxurious, multi-million-dollar yacht cutting smoothly across the bright blue ocean waves of Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. The camera panned across the sun deck, showing a massive party filled with beautiful people holding expensive bottles of champagne. And right in the absolute center of the massive screen, perfectly illuminated by the tropical sun, was my brother Terrence. He was not wearing dirty tactical gear or bloody bandages. He was wearing designer swim trunks and expensive mirrored sunglasses. He was holding a tall tropical cocktail in one hand, and he had his other arm wrapped tightly around the waist of his secret wife, Vanessa. The audio was perfectly clear, capturing Terrence laughing loudly and shouting about how much he absolutely loved his early retirement. The reaction in the grand ballroom was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic. A massive collective gasp ripped through the crowd of hundreds of people. The wealthy charity donors who had just written massive checks stared at the massive screen in pure, horrified shock. The politicians sitting at the front tables instantly dropped their polite smiles, their faces turning pale as they realized they were currently on live television honoring a massive fraud. The local news cameramen scrambled aggressively, adjusting their lenses to perfectly capture the tropical party footage playing on the massive screen behind the podium. I looked down at the front row and watched my mother Gloria completely shatter. Her jaw dropped open and the color rapidly drained from her face as she stared at the massive, undeniable proof of her son's luxurious betrayal. She finally realized she had bankrupted her entire life for a tropical vacation. The smug, arrogant mask on Terrence's face violently dissolved into a look of absolute sheer panic. He looked frantically back and forth between the massive screen and the hundreds of angry, disgusted faces staring up at him. He realized his entire criminal empire was collapsing on live television. He let out a desperate, angry shout and violently lunged across the stage, dropping his fake limp entirely. He reached out aggressively with both hands, trying to physically rip the microphone away from me to somehow stop the presentation. But I was completely ready for his violent reaction. I quickly sidestepped his aggressive lunge, letting his own forward momentum carry him clumsily past me. I reached into the hidden pocket of my cheap faded dress and pulled out a folded piece of heavy government paper. I gripped the microphone tightly and raised the official Department of Defense military death certificate high in the air for every single news camera to clearly see. I held the official military document high above my head, ensuring the bright stage lights illuminated the dark federal seal. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice echoing over the loud, confused murmurs of the massive ballroom. I announced that the man standing next to me was not a wounded medic, and he had never set foot in the country of Sudan. I explained that the tragic, heroic story he had been selling to the entire city actually belonged to a young man named Specialist Terrence Miller. I read the details of the official casualty report out loud, detailing how the real hero had tragically died shielding a civilian child 3 years ago. I stated that my brother simply stole the identity of a dead soldier because they shared the exact same first name. The wealthy donors in the audience began to shout in pure outrage. The local politicians who had just handed him the ceremonial key to the city looked completely physically sick. Terrence took another desperate step toward me, his face dripping with cold sweat, but he was completely trapped in the glaring spotlight with nowhere to hide. I did not give him a single second to recover or formulate a new lie. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the thick stack of printed financial ledgers Mark and I had compiled. I told the angry audience that the stolen valor was only the very beginning of his massive betrayal. I turned my attention directly to the senior church elders sitting at the VIP tables right in front of the stage. I looked them directly in the eyes, and I began reading the specific bank routing numbers printed on the fraudulent charity website. I read the digits slowly and clearly over the powerful sound system. I explained that the Sudan Relief Fund was absolutely not a registered charity at all. I told them it was a highly anonymous shell company explicitly registered to a tiny post office box in the state of Delaware. I read the outgoing wire transfer records revealing that every single dollar they had generously donated to save starving children was instantly routed to a private offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. I pointed at the massive projection screen still looping the tropical yacht video behind me. I announced that their hard-earned charity money was actively paying the massive mortgage on a $3 million beachfront villa in Cabo San Lucas. I told them they were completely funding his luxurious secret marriage while he stood before them pretending to be a broken, lonely victim. The ballroom completely erupted into absolute unhinged chaos. Wealthy donors were aggressively standing up from their tables, shouting demands for their money back. The mayor frantically signaled for his security detail to intervene, but the loudest, most violent reaction came directly from the very front row. My mother Gloria let out a blood-curdling scream that completely pierced through the chaotic noise of the angry crowd. She scrambled out of her chair, her expensive silver designer gown tangling around her legs as she aggressively rushed the stage. She scrambled up the carpeted stairs, her face twisted into a terrifying mask of absolute frantic denial. She lunged directly at me wildly, swinging her heavy arms and desperately trying to rip the silver microphone right out of my hands. She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the massive news cameras broadcasting her epic meltdown to the entire city. She shouted that I was a sick, jealous liar, and I had maliciously fabricated every single piece of paper in my hands. I easily stepped out of her frantic reach, watching her stumble clumsily across the brightly lit stage. I spoke clearly into the microphone, telling the entire audience that my own mother had completely bankrupted her entire retirement account to secretly fund his luxurious lifestyle. I announced that she had actively forged my legal signature to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars just to keep his massive criminal fantasy alive. She had completely destroyed herself for a devastating lie. Gloria collapsed onto her knees in the center of the stage, weeping hysterically and aggressively pounding her fists against the hard floor. Terrence was frantically looking toward the side exits, trying to calculate a desperate escape route through the massive angry mob of betrayed donors. The entire situation had reached an absolute boiling point of pure public outrage. Right at that exact moment, the heavy velvet curtains on the right side of the main stage were aggressively pulled back. Mark stepped out from the dark wings, walking with absolute calm authority directly into the blinding spotlight. He was not wearing his formal suit anymore. He was wearing his heavy tactical vest. And he was absolutely not alone. A highly coordinated team of federal agents, wearing dark jackets with massive yellow FBI letters printed across their backs, quickly flanked him on both sides. The angry audience instantly fell into a shocked, heavy silence as the armed federal authorities rapidly swarmed the stage. Mark walked directly up to me, completely ignoring the weeping woman on the floor and the panicking fraud trying to slowly back away. Mark gave me a single proud nod and gently took the silver microphone from my hand. He did not say a word to the stunned crowd. Instead, he turned and handed the microphone directly to Special Agent Davis, who was stepping up to the wooden podium. Agent Davis looked out over the completely silent ballroom and then turned his cold, authoritative gaze directly toward my brother. His deep, commanding voice echoed powerfully through the massive room, delivering the ultimate, devastating blow. He announced that Terrence Miller was officially under immediate federal arrest. He stated the severe charges clearly and deliberately for the live television broadcast, listing massive federal wire fraud, severe stolen military valor, and felony grand larceny. The trap had finally snapped shut on live television forever, ending his reign of toxic manipulation. The final echo of the federal charges hung in the heavy air of the ballroom like a death sentence. Terrence stood completely paralyzed for a fraction of a second, his perfectly constructed hero mask shattering into a million irreparable pieces. His dark eyes darted frantically around the massive room, taking in the sheer volume of federal agents actively moving in to secure the perimeter. The exits were entirely blocked by uniformed officers, and the local news cameras were relentlessly recording every single bead of sweat forming on his panicked face. The charming, confident war veteran was instantly replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He looked at Mark, who stood with a posture of absolute professional authority, and then he looked down at me, holding the undeniable documentary proof of his massive international crimes. He finally understood that his smooth-talking manipulation could not negotiate his way out of federal custody. The sheer terror of spending the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary overrode any remaining ounce of logic or self-preservation. He decided to run. Terrence spun around on his expensive leather dress shoes, his desperate eyes locking onto a small, heavy velvet curtain near the rear of the stage that led to the kitchen service corridors. He lunged forward, completely abandoning his fake medical limp. He sprinted across the brightly lit stage with the speed and agility of a perfectly healthy man, instantly confirming to the shocked audience that his physical injuries were just another theatrical lie. But his desperate escape route was suddenly blocked. My mother Gloria was still kneeling directly in the center of the stage, weeping hysterically and grabbing wildly at the air in a state of psychological shock. She was physically positioned right between Terrence and his only potential exit. A normal son, a man who actually possessed even a tiny fraction of the heroic compassion he aggressively preached about, would have stopped or tried to help his devastated mother. Terrence did neither. Without a single moment of hesitation, he violently shoved both of his hands directly into her shoulders. He pushed her with massive aggressive force, launching her backward to clear his path. Gloria hit the hard wooden stage with a sickening thud, her expensive silver designer gown tearing loudly as she slid. A collective gasp of pure horror erupted from the crowd as they watched the supposed family hero violently assault his own weeping mother just to save his own skin. But his brutal, cowardly act bought him absolutely zero time. Before Terrence could even reach the edge of the velvet curtain, 3 massive federal agents hit him simultaneously from the side. The physical impact was incredibly violent and absolute. They tackled him hard, driving his shoulder directly into the polished wooden floor of the stage. Terrence screamed in genuine pain as the heavy agents forcefully pinned his thrashing limbs. He violently fought back, kicking his legs and wildly twisting his torso, trying desperately to break free from the overwhelming federal grip. He completely dropped the gentlemanly persona, screaming vicious, vile profanities at the agents and threatening them with his imaginary political connections. Agent Davis stepped forward, dropping his full body weight onto my brother's back and aggressively wrenching both of his arms backward. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the microphone still lying on the podium. The great Terrence Miller was officially reduced to a pathetic, thrashing criminal pinned to the floor in front of his entire community. I looked away from my subdued brother and turned my attention back to the center of the stage. My mother Gloria was sitting awkwardly on the hard wooden floor, entirely tangled in the ripped fabric of her ruined crystal gown. She was not screaming or crying anymore. She was staring blankly at the exact spot where her golden child had just violently shoved her to the ground. She slowly raised her trembling hand and touched her bruised shoulder, the physical pain waking her up from her decades-long delusion. The absolute reality of who she had blindly worshipped and fiercely protected crashed down upon her in a devastating wave. She slowly looked out into the massive ballroom. Hundreds of people were staring back at her. The senior church elders she had proudly bragged to the politicians she had eagerly shaken hands with, and our extended family were all looking at her with absolute unfiltered disgust and profound pity. They all saw her eagerly fund a massive scam, and they all saw her beloved son violently discard her the absolute second she became an obstacle. She was completely alone in a room full of people. The federal agents roughly hauled Terrence up from the floor, dragging him by his handcuffed arms toward the side exit. His custom tuxedo was heavily ripped and covered in dust. As they forcefully pulled him toward the waiting police cruisers, the sheer panic of his new reality fully set in. He dug his expensive shoes into the carpet, trying to stall his inevitable exit. He twisted his neck around and locked his desperate eyes on our mother still sitting frozen on the stage. "Mama," he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute pathetic desperation. "Mama, call the lawyers right now. You have to bail me out. Use the house money. Do not let them take me away. Call the bank and wire the bail money tonight." Agent Davis stopped walking and looked down at the screaming fraud. He adjusted his dark suit jacket and spoke in a loud, clear voice, ensuring the news microphones picked up every single word. "She cannot bail you out, Terrence," he stated casually, his voice laced with cold professional justice. "We already seized the offshore accounts. Her retirement funds are gone, and the bank is officially foreclosing on her house tomorrow morning because of your forged signatures. She does not have a single dime left to her own name. You made absolutely sure of that." The gala ended in a chaotic blur of flashing police lights and panicked murmurs from the betrayed wealthy donors. I stood safely beside my husband Mark, watching the federal transport van drive away into the dark city night, carrying my vicious brother toward his inevitable fate. 3 months passed since that explosive night, and the heavy toxic fog that had suffocated my entire life finally lifted. The federal prosecutors built an absolutely impenetrable case against Terrence. Faced with the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence, the offshore banking records, and the high-definition yacht video, his expensive defense attorneys completely abandoned him. He was currently sitting in a maximum security federal detention center, awaiting his official sentencing hearing. The federal sentencing guidelines for his massive interstate wire fraud and his stolen military valor guaranteed he was facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. He would be an old, forgotten man by the time he ever saw the outside of a concrete cell again. My life, however, had completely transformed in the absolute best way possible. The exact moment the local news stations broadcasted the stunning truth about the fake charity, the angry internet mob attacking my business completely vanished. They were quickly replaced by thousands of supportive messages and a massive influx of new wealthy clients who deeply admired my fierce integrity. My luxury jewelry boutique was thriving more than ever before. It was a crisp Tuesday morning, and I was standing quietly in my private viewing room, carefully appraising a stunning vintage diamond necklace. The heavy reinforced front door of the boutique chimed softly, echoing through the polished showroom. My private security guard approached my viewing room with a highly cautious expression on his face. He respectfully informed me that there was a woman standing on the sidewalk outside repeatedly asking to speak with me. He mentioned she looked incredibly disheveled and carried 2 large black plastic trash bags filled with clothing. I walked out to the main showroom and looked through the thick bulletproof glass windows. Standing on the cold concrete sidewalk looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant matriarch who once wore a silver designer gown was my mother Gloria. The bank had aggressively executed the foreclosure on her beautiful home, perfectly keeping their legal promise. Without her stolen retirement funds, and with her golden child locked away in a federal cage, she had completely lost everything she valued. The senior church elders she had proudly bragged to completely excommunicated her to protect their own reputations in the community. Our extended family, including Aunt Beatrice, entirely refused to take her in after witnessing her horrific violent betrayal on live television. She was completely isolated from the world she once ruled. I unlocked the heavy glass door and allowed her to step into the warm, brightly lit boutique. She looked incredibly frail, her shoulders hunched forward in absolute defeat. Her clothes were heavily wrinkled and stained, a stark contrast to the immaculate, pristine displays surrounding her. Her shoes were scuffed, and her hair was completely unkempt. She did not look at me with arrogant superiority anymore. Her eyes were completely filled with raw, desperate panic. She set her heavy plastic bags down on the polished marble floor and immediately began to cry. Her tears were not manufactured this time. They were the bitter, agonizing tears of a woman who had completely destroyed her own universe. She looked up at me, her hands trembling wildly in the open space between us. "Jordan," she sobbed, her voice cracking with absolute physical exhaustion. "I have absolutely nowhere else to go. The local homeless shelters are completely full, and the church will not even answer my phone calls anymore. I have been sleeping on a hard wooden bench at the city bus terminal for 3 consecutive days. You have a massive, beautiful house, Jordan. You have extra guest rooms sitting completely empty right now. Please let your mother come home with you. I am begging you to show me some mercy and give me a safe place to stay." I stood completely still behind the thick glass display counter, watching her sob over her ruined life. A younger version of myself would have felt a massive wave of crushing emotional guilt. A younger version of me would have immediately unlocked my doors and sacrificed my own peace to frantically fix her terrible mistakes. But that insecure, desperate girl died the exact moment my mother forged my signature to steal my home. I looked at her crying on my polished floor, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, objective clarity. "Mercy," I repeated quietly, my voice echoing in the silent luxury showroom. "You come into my successful business and demand mercy because you are suddenly uncomfortable. I want you to take a very deep breath and remember a cold winter night exactly 16 years ago. I want you to remember when I was just 18 years old." My mother stopped crying and looked up at me in sudden, absolute confusion. I rested my hands on the cool glass counter, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I was working 3 grueling minimum wage jobs to desperately save money for my gemology certification, I reminded her slowly. It was the middle of December, and the city was completely buried under a massive freezing blizzard. Terrence decided he was suddenly tired of walking to the local fitness center. He told you he desperately needed a personal home gym to focus on his physical health. And you decided that my small childhood bedroom was the absolute perfect location for his new heavy lifting equipment. She stared at me, her face turning completely pale as the horrific memory finally resurfaced in her mind. I reminded her of exactly what she did next without a single drop of mercy. "You did not ask me to move into the basement, Mother. You packed my meager belongings into cheap cardboard boxes, and you explicitly told me I was taking up valuable space that your golden boy desperately needed. You physically pushed me out of the front door into a freezing, violent snowstorm with absolutely nowhere to go. You locked the heavy deadbolt right in my face while I stood on the frozen porch begging you for a place to sleep. You threw your own teenage daughter out into the deadly freezing cold just so Terrence could have a private room to lift metal weights." I watched the devastating realization wash over her face. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, hollow excuse, but the words completely failed her. She knew there was absolutely no defense for her historical cruelty. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a cheap plastic prepaid flip phone and a printed sheet of white paper. The paper contained a highly detailed list of local public women's shelters and state-funded soup kitchens. I placed the items on the polished glass counter and slowly pushed them across the smooth surface toward her trembling hands. "I am a jeweler, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute whisper. "I only deal in things that are real, and there is nothing real about your love for me. Security will show you out." After watching my mother walk out of my boutique for the final time escorted by my security guard, I felt a profound weight physically lift from my shoulders. The heavy glass door closed behind her, sealing away decades of manipulation and toxic obligation forever. I turned back to my velvet displays, breathing in the clean, quiet air of my personal sanctuary. I finished my workday with a renewed sense of absolute purpose and drove home through the bustling city streets to the man who had stood fiercely beside me through the absolute darkest storm of my entire life. Mark was waiting for me in our living room with a warm fire crackling cheerfully in the stone fireplace. The evening was incredibly peaceful, a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic screaming matches and hospital showdowns from just a few months ago. He handed me a glass of red wine and pointed silently to a thick stack of envelopes resting on our oak coffee table. They were letters from my extended family. The exact same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had instantly blocked my phone number when I desperately tried to warn them about the international fraud were now frantically flooding our personal mailbox. I picked up the top envelope, recognizing Aunt Beatrice's perfectly rigid handwriting. I opened the heavy paper and read her desperate apologies. She claimed she was completely blinded by my mother's vicious lies and begged for a second chance to be part of my successful life. The very next letter was from my older cousin Marcus, asking for a massive small business loan now that his beloved hero was locked away in a federal cell. Every single letter followed the exact same pathetic, predictable pattern. They were not genuinely apologizing for blindly abandoning me to a criminal. They were simply trying to attach themselves to the only wealthy family member they had left standing. I looked at Mark, who was watching me with quiet understanding from the sofa. I did not feel a single ounce of anger anymore, just a deep, profound indifference. I gathered the entire stack of unopened and read letters, holding them tightly in my hands. I walked directly over to the stone fireplace and tossed the heavy bundle right into the rolling orange flames. The thick, expensive paper caught fire, instantly curling and turning to dark gray ash in a matter of seconds. I watched the names of my toxic relatives burn away, entirely erasing their sudden, desperate attempts to claw their way back into my peaceful world. Mark walked over and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder as we watched the bright fire consume the last remaining ties to my painful past. With the toxic roots completely severed, it was finally time to plant something genuinely beautiful. The next morning, I walked into my bank carrying the exact certified cashier check for $250,000 that I had originally promised to give Terrence at the gala. But this massive amount of money was no longer destined for a fraudulent offshore shell company or a luxury Mexican villa. I sat down with my senior financial advisors and officially established a permanent educational endowment. I created a legitimate, fully transparent scholarship fund specifically designed for young African American women pursuing advanced degrees in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and forensic investigation. I wanted to actively empower brilliant young minds to seek the absolute truth and build highly independent careers, just like Mark and I had done. The very first scholarship recipient was a brilliant young woman from the south side of Chicago studying complex forensic pathology. Meeting her and seeing the genuine bright gratitude in her eyes completely erased any lingering shadows my brother had cast over my life. I was taking the exact financial weapon they tried to use to destroy me and turning it into a powerful tool to uplift the next generation of strong women. This entire grueling journey completely reshaped how I view the world and the people operating in it. If you are watching this video and you are currently suffocating under the heavy, crushing weight of toxic family expectations, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. You do not owe your peace, your sanity, or your hard-earned success to the people who actively refuse to respect your fundamental boundaries. Sharing a biological bloodline does not automatically grant someone a permanent all-access pass to disrespect you or drain your emotional and financial resources. Sometimes the absolute most difficult, but entirely necessary act of radical self-love is packing up your belongings and walking away from the people who intentionally keep you feeling small. You have to be willing to aggressively prune the dead toxic roots from your family tree so you can finally allow yourself the proper space to grow. As a professional gemologist, I can confidently tell you that real diamonds are only forged under immense, incredible pressure, but they must be completely separated from the worthless surrounding dirt before they can truly catch the light and shine. Do not let guilty obligations bury your brilliance. Demand the absolute truth from the people around you, and more importantly, demand the absolute truth from yourself. My boutique is expanding rapidly, opening a second location next year, and my marriage to Mark has never been stronger. We spend our weekends traveling, enjoying our quiet suburban home, and building a lasting legacy based entirely on honesty and mutual respect. I no longer look over my shoulder, waiting in terror for the next dramatic family emergency or the next aggressive demand for my money. The silence in my life is incredibly beautiful and deeply fulfilling. People constantly ask me in the comments if I have any lingering regrets about that explosive night at the gala. They ask if I regret exposing my own blood to the federal authorities and letting my mother lose absolutely everything she owned. I look at the beautiful, honest life I have built with a man who truly sees me and the absolute peace in my silent house, and I tell them exactly this. The only thing sharper than a forensic scalpel is the truth, and the truth set me free. The most profound lesson woven through these stories of betrayal is that our inherent worth is never determined by the inability of others to value us, even when those people are our own family. Society often pushes the narrative that blood ties are an unbreakable bond, requiring endless sacrifice and unconditional forgiveness. However, as these narratives so powerfully illustrate, sharing a genetic link or a legal document does not grant anyone a free pass to inflict continuous abuse, manipulation, or disrespect. When we grow up in toxic environments where affection is conditional or weaponized, it is easy to internalize the belief that we are the problem. We shrink ourselves to fit into boxes labeled scapegoat or outsider, desperately hoping that one more compromise will finally earn us the love we deserve. Yet the turning point in true healing arrives when we recognize that a toxic family member's cruelty is a reflection of their own brokenness, not a measure of our value. Walking away from a destructive family dynamic is not an act of selfish abandonment. It is a profound, courageous act of radical self-preservation. It is the realization that true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, safety, and consistent support. By setting firm boundaries and stepping into the painful but necessary silence that follows, we create the space required to discover who we are outside of their shadows. We learn to build our own chosen families from those who celebrate our light, rather than trying to extinguish it. You are allowed to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and give yourself the permission to establish firm boundaries that fiercely protect your peace.